So the question is, are the Iranians activating the Houthis, or are the Houthis looking at this situation and saying that how can we leverage this to our advantage? The Houthis are independent actors. They are not your classic proxy that Iran has cultivated. They're definitely not Hezbollah. I mean, think of the best analogy that I can come up with is a corporate one. So there are independent operators who assume the franchise but act independently. They're not part of the corporate structure in that sense. They're not like a corporate shop, if you will. Hezbollah is a corporate shop. It was created by the Iranians, nurtured by them. They're very much part of, Iran Incorporated. The Houthis existed way before the Iranians began this project, and they'll be here way after whatever happens to this regime. It evolves or turns into something else. So the Houthis joined the so-called Axis of Resistance Corporation, saying, "Look, we'll take your franchise, but and we like the intelligence, and the money helps and the weapons help and technology and so on and so forth, but we'll decide when we're going to act and where." And so I think that is what's going on here. The Houthis see this as an opportunity. The Houthis see that the Saudis shifted a good chunk of their oil exports through the East-West pipeline through Yanbu, the Red Sea port, and are using the Bab al-Mandab as an export route while the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted. And they also know that the Saudis and the Gulf states in general would like to reduce dependency, medium to long-term dependency on the Strait of Hormuz as much as possible. So they're diversifying routes. So if you're the Houthis, and what is your imperative? Your imperative is, how can I leverage this situation to ensure that not only does the regime in Sana'a get secured, how can I secure my regime, but also enhance power? Bear in mind, the Houthis have two factions that they're competing with in Yemen. One is the Saudi-backed, internationally recognized government in Aden in the south. And then there is the Southern Transitional Council, which is backed by the UAE. And so their first order of business is, whatever we do disrupt, the Strait, the Bab al-Mandab, and whatever, that has to help our primary objective, meaning the Houthi primary objective, which is to secure, consolidate power, and enhance it. And so that's what they're trying to do. The biggest evidence for that is that the Houthis sat out the worst of the war. When Iran was at its lowest point historically during the 39-day war between February 28th and April 8th, when the ceasefire went into effect, they didn't do anything. They issued statements. They lobbed a couple of drones or missiles at Israel, but that's about it. This is as opposed to what they were doing after the war in Gaza began in late 2023. So, and even that was geared towards this imperative, the domestic imperative. So I wouldn't say that the Iranians have activated, and the Iranians will benefit, but I don't think it's a case of, the Iranians saying jump and the Houthis saying, sir, how high? So, yes. I mean, look, let's look at the imperatives of the Russians and the Chinese. Again, what's in it for them? Uh, Certainly, China does not want Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz. They've made that amply clear. They want the waterway open because this is where they import stuff from. Russia, what is more important for Russia? It's Ukraine. It's the Ukrainians striking drones deep inside Russian territory, disrupting their fuel supply chain, and hitting, refineries and whatnot. That's more important than the Iran war for the Russians. Now, the question is, in an ideal scenario, both of these countries both Moscow and Beijing, would love to be able to leverage the Iran war to their advantage. I mean, all things being equal, the United States bogged down in another war uh, from a Chinese and a Russian perspective is good. And they'd like to be able to exploit that to the max. But they can't because they have other things that they're dealing with. And then, of course, the United States is the only country, along with Israel, that is actually doing something about the fact that the Iranians are trying to develop nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean other countries want Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So it's not in the Russian interest, it's not in the Chinese interest. So, yeah, I mean, they'll leverage it. They'll say, hey, they'll signal to the United States, we'll help you with this Iran issue, but what's in it for us? Will need some concessions in areas that are important, more important for us. So, yeah, I don't think that the Chinese, because the Chinese have a geoeconomic relationship with the United States to sort out. That's way more important than Iran for the Chinese. And they don't want anything to upset that. And as I said, they have no interest. Actually, they oppose it very deeply. The idea that the Iranians want to be able to, have a disproportionate amount of control of oil flow and energy flows and trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So I don't think that the Chinese are doing. Are the Russians doing something? Yeah, I mean, they may be providing targeting intelligence. They may be doing things to, again, only to gain the US attention. They are not joining Iran. They are mindful of that balance. So if, they help in some tactical way, they provide some assistance to the Iranians, and that gets the US attention, and the US comes to the table and says, let's discuss Ukraine, and they can leverage that to have their demands vis-a-vis Ukraine heard and met ideally, then sure. But beyond that, I don't think that the Chinese or the Russians are interested in this war. Look, I think the relationship between Israel and the United States is deeply misunderstood. There's a lot of media spin, uh, and in both directions. There are those who say, that it's sort of the tail wagging the dog, that narrative, which is conspiracy theory. The reality is Israel needs the United States. Now, can Israel sort of push as far as it wants to? Sure. Every partner, junior, senior in any relationship, will push, their objectives as far as they can. But in the end, there is a limit, and I think that that limit has been reached. And Israel doesn't want that to happen. In other words, get to a point where U.S. Israeli interests diverge to where there's a breakdown in relations between Washington and Jerusalem. That no Israeli government would want that, including that of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think we need to wait and see what comes out tomorrow from the meeting that the president will have with the Prime Minister of Israel. They haven't met in a while, and Israel has been out of the war since April, at least since early April. And so we need to see where this is going. I think that at the end of the day, there's only so much that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can do to save his sort of political position in Israel. The polls are showing that he's really down. But you never know. I mean, these are tricky things. I mean, polls say one thing and then elections produce some other results, and then everybody's left surprised, scratching their head. So we're going to have to wait and see. The midterms are in the United States are in November, and the Israeli parliamentary elections are in late October. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But if Israel, his interests are being served by the United States, then why does it need to complicate things? I just don't see that happening. And one thing is for sure. I mean, look, ideally, the Israelis would like to see this regime collapse, but that's not happening. And if it just yet, if it will, it'll be an attrition, and that's sort of a slow burn, if you will, and we don't know where things are headed. So, but as long as Iran is not, dashing to the nuclear threshold, and Iran remains weakened, then I think that that's a convergence of American and Israeli interests. I don't think anybody is rejecting off-ramps. I mean, all sides have constraints in any conflict. In this case, the United States, the president has a few constraints. Midterms are coming around. His position is not up for re-election, but his party's position in Congress is, and that's important to him. The price of oil on the international markets and the price of gasoline on the American pump is also important because of that. Then you have limits on just how much hardware is available right now. Interceptors and precision munitions. You don't want to dip into the reserves that are meant for other theaters that are kept for a doomsday scenario or a rainy day, if you will. And it takes time to replenish. The United States has been expending these resources for quite some time. You look at how much was given to Ukraine, and then how much has been expended in this war. And this war goes back to last year, the 12-day war as well. It's not just what the U.S. is expending directly, but it's also what's being given to Israel. So all of that, is also a constraint. So the president has to juggle that. Now, does that mean he doesn't want an off ramp? No, I think, look, if he can get an off ramp, this president has been very open and he's been criticized heavily from within his own party for being, for going soft on Iran, and for not completing the job, so to speak. But he's weathered that because he's mindful that at the end of the day, uh, you know, the United States needs a deal with Iran. And you don't want to keep hitting Iran to the point where there's nobody left to do a deal with. Already, because of the elimination of the top civil and military leadership, the whole place is factionalized and they can't come together. There is some loose consensus, but the consensus doesn't go too far. The biggest evidence of that is even after the MOU, they struck those three ships. There was no need to strike those three ships because you disagree on some interpretation of an article about the Strait of Hormuz. Those can be worked out. But the fact that they decided to strike those three ships, they knew very well that they're going to be hit. That really points to a fundamental disagreement inside Iran amongst the various players, and in terms of how they want to move forward. There are those who say Trump's in a bind, we have him in a bind, let's keep the pressure, and we can weather the cost. There is an assumption that we can weather the cost. There are those who oppose that and say, no, this would be a serious miscalculation. Let's not play with fire here. We've already suffered a lot, and let's not, if you will, tempt fate here. And so there is that disagreement. So I think that, look, it's not like they don't want an off ramp. They can't agree. The president has political economic constraints, and it's existential for the Iranians. So it's a mess. I mean, that's why you're not seeing an off ramp, if you will, or the ability of both sides to sort of say, okay, let's put the fighting behind us. So what you're seeing is uh, talks and then fighting, and the talks don't lead to a situation where you can actually start having the substantive outline of what could be a deal. That's a great question, and I have to say that because the situation is opaque, I don't think we have like a good understanding. Anybody has a good understanding of what calculi are moving around in Iran and what is being debated. We have sort of broad contours of what could be debated. But having said that, let me try to answer your question. So I think that the uh, Iranian calculus, or that of the hardliners, and uh, they're not a monolith. There are many types of hardliners and there are many types of pragmatists, and it's a mess. But let's just focus on those who are saying, hey, let's continue to push this as far as we can. So I think what they're thinking is, look, Trump can only go so far before it becomes painful for him. There's a clock ticking. They understand the American political cycle very well. And so they're trying to exploit the political economic compulsions of the president. But at the same time, they look at themselves and they say, um, yes, we're being hit, but war has created a situation where we face no internal threat to no internal challenge. There isn't a group inside the country that can benefit from this. And everybody's interest is to stick it together. We may disagree with each other, but there is sort of the moment of solidarity that if each faction is going to come out of this, looking good, then they have to stick together. And then they're also looking at the United States and saying, are they going to put ground troops? It was interesting to see the one of the spokespersons of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps come out today and say that they don't think that the US, he dismissed reports in the Iranian media that the US would deploy ground forces. And the arguments that were given were surprisingly the same arguments that I'm hearing from the American side. And so they take comfort from that, that look, there's no group in the country that can topple us. Yes, we're being hit by airstrikes. We've weathered that. As long as this continues, there is no mobilization of any opposition forces. And then the U.S. is not going to send ground forces, so we can wait this out. We have time. We don't need to rush to a deal. Let's try to maximize it. So I think that, in my view, is the calculus. But I bet you that those who are opposed to this view in the Iranian system, they are deeply concerned of the potential for this to be a serious miscalculation, and that the US could, find a way because it has far more resources and it can, work around the problem of limited munitions or munition stockpiles running low. It has technological means to get around that. We're caught in between these two perspectives inside Iran. That's a good question as well. So, look, that obviously U.S. actions have had, an unintended consequence is that it has sort of strengthened that narrative inside Iran. That look, all you guys who think you can trust the United States or you can go and, meet people in Geneva, all you diplomats, you're quick to try and cut a deal. I'm talking about, the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf, the Foreign Minister, Mr. Abbas Araghchi, and all these people. I mean, these are the public faces, but there is an entire camp of pragmatists who want to reach a deal inside Iran. You just had an essay from former Foreign Minister and Vice President for Strategic Affairs, Jawad Zarif, in foreign affairs, talking about what an end of hostilities could look like, or what a potential scenario could look like. So there's criticism on those people who from the hawks in the establishment saying, you're assuming the U.S. can be trusted, but look at its behavior; it cannot be trusted. So I think that there is that problem. Now, as far as the potential for a lasting deal, a deal that can actually work, I think I agree with you. I think that the probability of that is becoming, less and less as time goes on, as more fighting continues. Because what it does is it exacerbates those internal fault lines in Iran. So if you look at it from an American point of view, the president hasn't, and I don't want to speak for him, the president hasn't reached the point where he thinks that a deal cannot be done at all with Iran. But he could get to that point. I mean, there are now, open source reporting that he is considering that possibility that, you know what, we've been at it for so long, and maybe it's just not possible for the Iranians to come and make a deal. Even in his own sort of statements to the press, he's brought this up that they want to make a deal, but they can't. And he's trying to give chances. You see this from the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. You see it from Vice President J.D. Vance, and you also see it from the Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. That look, we want diplomacy to work. We're willing to give it a chance. But what if we reach a point where it becomes the consensus in Washington becomes that, you know what, these guys are so divided that let's say even if we cut a deal, and is everybody going to abide by it? We just did an MOU, and then look what happened. And according to the White House perspective, that they got the people that they're talking to through the Pakistanis and the Qataris told them that look, it was a mistake. We didn't, this was not intended. This is some people on our side who, pulled the trigger on this, the attack on the three tankers. So those kind of things really decrease confidence on the American side that a deal could be done. So that's why I think that the ball is in the Iranian court. Uh, and the big question to ask is, are they in a position, are they capable, all the various stakeholders inside the Iranian political establishment, are they in a position to come together and agree to certain terms, and then it will last? And honestly, I'm not very confident that that is the case, but I'm willing to be surprised. I think the point that we're approaching is I think we need to stop thinking of Iran as a singular entity. I think that there are elements, different elements that are trying to shape national policy. And there isn't a consensus on that. So yes, there are those who think that, based on the calculus I mentioned earlier, that hey, we don't face any organized group willing to challenge our regime. U.S. is not putting ground forces in the country, so we can live with this for some time to come. So, and then they look at it and say, what are the Pakistanis going to do? Attack us? Then we'll attack them. Do they really want that? I mean, Pakistan's western flank, everything west of the Indus is already on fire. You've got the TTP insurgency in KPK, and in Balochistan, you have both TTP and Baloch separatists. And then the relationship with the Taliban regime is very bad. The Pakistan, for all intents and purposes, is in a state of war with the Islamic Emirate in Kabul. And so the Iranians see that and say, what are the Pakistanis going to do? Are they going to attack us? Then we'll hit them back. Do they really want to go down that route? So it's kind of like, I'm in a bad situation, but I can still cause pain to the other side, pain that the other side isn't ready for. And so they look at that. But there are those also in Iran who I have to believe that are saying we can't fight on all these fronts. Okay. If Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have a strategic mutual defense agreement, there's some understanding that's been reached with Kuwait, although it's not the level of a mutual defense agreement. But there's no way the Saudis are going to say, oh, well, you know what? We just want you to come and fight on our side, and we're going to ignore what happens in Kuwait. The Saudis cannot ignore what happens in Kuwait and Bahrain. Okay. These are countries right next door. And so I don't think that the Pakistanis will be just limited to that. And then what the Houthis are doing, that's more of a problem. Let's say the Iranians sort of say, hey, let's hold off. Notice they're holding off on Israel. Okay. Even though Israel has been continuously going after Hezbollah, though that has sort of the frequency of that has gone down, it's still going after Hamas. But the Iranians are staying away from that because what they know is that the Americans are not seeking regime change, and their attacks are very targeted. Even the last, 2 weeks of every single night, there was a campaign of airstrikes for the last 2 weeks from the Americans. If you look at each one of those targets, very carefully selected across a broad geography, but not going for the jugular. The Iranians cannot assume that from the Israelis, so they're staying away from that because they will come and they will target. They don't know, they could target the supreme leader. The Iranians have to assume that Israeli penetration of the Iranian system is still there. What's holding them back is the Americans. And if the Americans sort of lift that sort of restraint, then we could be in deeper trouble. So again, I think that it just depends who we're talking about in Iran. We just had yesterday the Ukrainian strike on an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea. This is really widening the war. Uh, the Iranians today, as I was walking into your in this podcast, we had that statement from the Iranian foreign minister that this cannot be ignored. So, in other words, he's threatening to retaliate. So, if they retaliate against the Ukrainians, that's another front. Okay, then the Turks are awfully quiet. And they're not the Saudis. They're not going to wait for the Pakistanis to come in and help them. They will strike. And so, uh, especially if there's something happens with Azerbaijan because it's on the Caspian Sea. So because they're allies. And so Iranians are looking at this, but then again, um, there isn't one Iranian sort of center of gravity in Tehran.